Hello and welcome to another Joe and Kat Chats.
Absolutely.
Today,
It's that time of the week. We're back together again. And ooh la la. It's going to be a great one today. How are you feeling, Kat?
I'm feeling good, energized, but very busy. So,
Understood. Understood.
Yeah. How about yourself, Joe?
I'm doing what I know how to do best. I'm trying to save the world 1 minute at a time.
Yeah. I mean, that's what we're in this for real.
Exactly what it's here. That's exactly what we're here for. And there's today's conversation is going to be, I guess, somewhat near and dear and close to my heart because we are going to talk about refugees. We're going to talk about the refugee crisis around the world. We are going to talk about the refugee situation in the United States and in Canada. And there's, as some of you may or may not know, I've got 2 master's degrees and you can see them behind me. And in both places, in both schools, University of Baltimore and at Wake Forest University, I worked with refugees. I was a former intern at the International Rescue Committee. I was a volunteer at World Relief, and I worked at the Center for Housing and Community Studies at the University of North Carolina at Greensboro, where I was working with a group of Burmese refugees, or Burman refugees, let me be correct, Burman refugees, to determine why their rates of asthma and diabetes were higher than other refugee groups in the Greensboro, North Carolina area. So I got to work with a wide variety of refugees during my 4 years of graduate school, and a lot of personal stories, a lot of anecdotes, a lot of information, a lot of late nights and early mornings writing papers about refugees, doing slideshows and presentations about them the next day, and all of that stuff. So it's going to be an interesting conversation, and a conversation that I've got quite a bit of knowledge about because I've actually had to, for months on end, work with refugees 5 days a week, Monday through Friday. Okay, hey, let's work with this group today. Let's work with this group today. And especially in and around April of 2015, really when the Syrian refugees began to come to the United States, my caseload went from mostly Ethiopians, Eritreans, and Cameroonians to almost exclusively Syrian refugees. And the situation with Syrian refugees and their linguistic issues and health problems, sure, some of that was common among all the refugees I was working with, regardless of where they were from, whether it was Nepalese refugees or refugees from Rwanda or Colombia. But Syrian refugees had specialized issues that needed a bit more care and concern, than other refugees groups that I had worked with.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I actually am really excited to do this episode with you because of not only your credentials in working with well, that is what your master's degrees provide context of your credential, but also like the stories that you have and the personal anecdotes that you may have, because that's what really grounds things for me, is when I get to hear sort of the narratives of human beings, and so I feel like it's exciting for me, and hopefully for everyone listening too.
I agree. And the conversation, I mean, obviously we're talking about refugees, and what is a refugee? I mean, people have an idea of what it is, but what is a refugee? A refugee is a person who has to leave their country because of a well-founded fear of persecution or violence. Now, people are like, well, Joe, what does persecution mean? Because here at the Joe and Kat Chat series, we like to provide not only context, but concrete definitions for the vernacular that we're using in our day-to-day conversations. So persecution is systematic mistreatment of an individual or group by another individual or group. Okay, I'm going to say that again just so I enunciate properly. Persecution is a systematic mistreatment of an individual or a group by another individual or group. Persecution. Now, the types of persecution that refugees face are from race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or membership of a social group. Again, 5 types of persecution: race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or membership of a social group. Those 5. Now, refugees, there are approximately 79.5 million refugees around the world. And that's according to the United Nations High Commission for Refugees data. And that's from fiscal year 29, or really not, actually is fiscal year because they're a nonprofit and they will be on fiscal year. It's from fiscal year 2019. Yeah. Now, most of the refugees are coming from several Asian countries. You all can look that up. But in many instances, war, violence, they're the major reasons why there is this type of persecution and why people from these countries have to go to other countries. And the process of going from one country to another country, a third-party country, what's called a host country, that process, or as my Canadian sister would say, process, is what's called repatriation. So going from one country to another is repatriation. Now, if you are a refugee, and again, in the past, I've worked with a variety of refugees. So let's say you're a refugee from Asmara, Eritrea, okay? From Eritrea, Eastern Horn of Africa. And typically what happens is you're a refugee, you file refugee paperwork, and you go to a refugee camp. You go to a refugee camp, and you have to wait until you get called to get repatriated. And sometimes it's like wait months. Other times you might wait years, but you wait and you hurry up and wait. Now, there are, I can't remember exactly, but I think there are, either 28 or 32 countries around the world that accept refugees. But the majority of them, it's usually 10 countries that accept refugees. The United States used to be the world leader in accepting refugees, but until the Trump administration came in, we dramatically decreased what's called the refugee allotment year by year. In fiscal year 2016, the refugee allotment was 85,000 people. And when I say refugee, that's with an asterisk, because there are a variety of other people that qualify under that allotment, but we just say refugee allotment. That way we're not saying refugees, asylum seekers, and all the other people that get humanitarian aid. But it was 85,000 people. In 2016, the number was going to go from 85,000 to 120,000 people. President Trump comes in and says, well, it's 120, no, we're not doing this 120,000 thing. Also, you know what, we're going to suspend the refugee access program for 90 days. So for 3 months, nobody's coming into the country. And then if you remember one of the press conferences he said, you know, we're just going to take a look at things and reevaluate things. We're going to take a look into all of this. Those were his words, not mine. So then he said, okay, you know what, 50,000. So in 2016, 50,000. Next year, it's like, you know what, we're not letting that many refugees in, 40,000. Okay, you know what? Year after that, 30,000. I think the number for this year, and I actually might need to look this up just for accuracy purposes, because we at the Joe and Cat Chat series enjoy being accurate. The annual ceiling, and that is the actual technical term for this, the annual ceiling for calendar year 2020 is 18,000. Annual ceiling for 2019 was 30,000. The ceiling for 2018 was 45,000. The ceiling for 2017 was 50,000. The ceiling for 2016 was 85,000. And from 85,000, that number was going to go to 120,000. So the annual ceiling for this year is 18,000. 18,000. Today's date, we are at the end of September. As of the accuracy of this data right now, which goes up to March 5, because it takes a while to actually get this information, the actual number of refugees that have been admitted into the United States is 6,674.
Holy shit.
6,674. And this is based on a ceiling of 18,000.
Yeah.
6,674. And this is data that's basically that ended in March. So 6,674 to, and again, we have about 3 months left in the year. And we have an election in 33 or 34 days in the United States. And every year Congress goes through and says, hey, you know what, how many people are we letting in? And clearly the Trump administration has shown themselves to be not only xenophobic, but shown themselves to be anti-immigration.
Mm-hmm.
It's entirely possible that next year, the ceiling could be the floor, as in 0.
Yeah. Yeah, clearly it's been cut in half every year that Trump has had his administration. And I just want to express that this is not a good thing. Like,
No.
it is wild to me that it's only 18,000 for a country as large as the USA in population and in geographic, like, location.
Yes.
18,000 refugees is basically nothing. It's about the same in Canada. It's about 20,000 for privately sponsored refugees.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's an additional 10,000 for like government sponsored refugees.
Okay.
And that was about the same. It went up a little bit between 2019 and to 2020, which I don't know if the COVID pandemic has impacted that, which I assume it has. Clearly people were not traveling at all for several months, like half the year.
Sure.
So I'm certain that has impacted the numbers in both of our countries. But yeah, for a country as big as the United States of America, 18,000 as a ceiling has, when 3 years prior you were getting almost 100,000, like, that has serious implications for people trying to seek refugee status, asylum status, all of the things, internally displaced people. Yeah, I guess I'm just fumbling over my words because I'm emotionally charged by this, because the conditions in which these people are living are horrendous and dangerous. And so you don't become a refugee or an asylum seeker just by chance. There are circumstances that make your life at risk, and that's why you become a refugee. So this anti-immigration policy just has vast implications for the livelihood of many people who are seeking this status. And I just would argue that the United States and Canada are part of the problem, because they're creating a lot of the conditions in which refugees need to flee their countries. So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't have said it better. If you take a look at military intervention in the Middle East, if you take a look at the proxy wars that have taken place in the Middle East, the United States, and again, you can talk about ISIS. You can look up United States funding of ISIS. You can Google a terminology called timber sycamore.
Mm-hmm.
Look that up. And we created the refugee crisis in Syria. And I know we were talking about this off camera. When I was working at the International Rescue Committee, I was an intern there for about 6 months or so, probably a little bit more than 6 months. And the second half of my time there, I was working exclusively with Syrian refugees. It didn't matter if they were from Damascus or the other big city was a city called Homs, Homs. I was working with Syrian refugees almost exclusively. And in many instances, the Syrian refugees did not know English. So it made communication a bit difficult. Additionally, the type of Arabic that most of the Syrian refugees spoke was a specific type of Arabic called Mesopotamian Arabic or Syrian Arabic, which is not necessarily, you just can't call an interpreter and say, hey, let me get an Arabic interpreter on the phone. It doesn't always work that way, because Syrian Arabic is a bit of a different dialect, almost to the point where it's almost its own distinct language. So you have to specifically ask for a Syrian Arabic interpreter. I vividly remember one time when I was working with one of the Syrian refugees I was working with. It's a lovely gentleman. I'll leave his name out of it. Lovely guy, married, and he was married with 5 kids. So it was 7 of them. So I was responsible for looking after 7 people. And Monday through Friday, I stopped by the house at 8:30, and me and the refugee and the family would get on the phone, and I'm here with my Google Translator and on the phone with the interpreter and trying to communicate with people because, you know, that's what we needed to do. And actually, let me stand up here because I'm getting a little bit uncomfortable sitting. But after a while, you got to know these people personally. You got to understand that, you know what, their situation in terms of what they want out of life is not that much different than what I wanted out of life or what you wanted out of life. They just, you know, I love R&B, and one of my favorite R&B singers is Mary J. Blige. And Mary J. Blige had a song called Be Happy. And she said, all I really want is to be happy. And that's all these people really want, is that they just want to be happy. And they want freedom, and they want a chance to, you know, learn English and keep their culture and raise a family and not have to worry about if they're going to be bombed out of their home in a week or two. So I remember, again, with the Syrian refugee situation specifically, I mean, I remember one time I was taking one of the refugees to an English class at a local church, and another Sudanese refugee who I had worked with in the past was there. And I remember the Sudanese refugee greeted the Syrian refugee the same way, merhaba, which is Arabic for welcome. It's an Arabic greeting. And I don't know, the pronunciation might be bad, but that's kind of the general idea. And the Syrian refugee said something in Arabic to the Sudanese refugee. The Sudanese refugee looked at him like, I have no idea what you just said. And again, it was Arabic. But again, it's a different type of Arabic. So it's in every instance, not I should say every instance, but in many instances with the refugees that I worked with in the past, fleeing their particular homeland from violence, specifically war, was a major reason. In many instances, some of the refugees I worked with were victims of torture. And then sometimes when you have to sit with an interpreter and the interpreter is listening to what's being said in whatever that language that is, whether it's, you know, whatever dialect or whatever variation of Burmese or Nepalese or, gosh, sometimes French, depending on what their language was, or Lingala or Swahili or Sango or Amharic or Tigrinya or Arabic. And then you're hearing what happens. And then me being the case guy, I'm taking down notes. And then I'm having to do a journal every day as part of my assignment for school, and just rereading some of the stuff that I had to sit through. There were plenty of nights where I didn't go to bed right away. Mm-hmm. And there were plenty of times when in these kind of social service jobs, it's easy to become attached to people emotionally, because for them, you are their help. You're how they're managing their lives on a day-to-day basis until they can do things on their own and they can reach a certain level of self-sufficiency. And you get to know these people on a personal basis. You know when to ask questions. You know when to just be quiet and listen. You know when to not hold their hands when they're trying to get on the bus. You know when to hold their hands when they're at the doctor's office getting a health screening. There were some situations that were incredibly difficult, and I guess we'll talk about that more and more. But we want to kind of get back on track. But you mentioned asylum seekers. Now, the major difference between a refugee and an asylum seeker: a refugee has no choice as to which country he or she wants to get repatriated to. So again, if you are that Eritrean refugee and all of a sudden you get a call or an Ethiopian refugee and you get a call and it's okay, hey, you're going to Denmark. Okay, you're on the next flight out to Copenhagen. Now, what will happen is the International Organization of Migration will give you what's called a promissory note, basically a loan, a travel loan, to say, hey, you know what, here's the airfare to get you from Asmara, Eritrea, or Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, to Copenhagen, Denmark. Then you're going to Copenhagen, Denmark. Somebody at Copenhagen, Denmark, at some refugee resettlement agency, meet you, they pick you up, they take you to wherever you're going to be staying temporarily, you get a health screening, they talk to you about the benefits you're eligible to receive, they talk to you about job training, job placement, language learning, etc. I vividly remember years ago when I played a show in Copenhagen, Denmark, and I'm using that Copenhagen, Denmark example specifically because I remember one of the cab drivers that picked me up when I was on my way to the venue called the Bolsefabriken. It was in Copenhagen, Denmark. It's this old squatter's house. It was a great time there. And you don't see a whole lot of darker skinned people hanging out in Copenhagen, Denmark. It's just a lot of white folks. So brother with rather curly hair picks me up and he's like, hey, what's going on? I'm like, hey, man, hello. And I told him where I was going. I showed him on the address. And I looked at him and I said, Ethiopia? And he said, yes. I said, salam. And salam is a typical way you greet an Ethiopian. And he said, how did you know that? And I said, oh, I used to work with Ethiopian refugees years ago. And he told me, yes, I was a refugee. I just been here about 8 months. And I said, your English is this good? He said, yes, I learned English when I was in school in Ethiopia. So you see this happen not only in Europe, but obviously in the United States. Now, if you're an asylum seeker is a person who has that fear of persecution, but they fund their way to the country where they want to go, and then they beg for permission to stay. That's realistically what it is. And typically, asylum seekers are usually students. They're usually, in some cases, they're tourists, but they don't enter as refugees. But they have to prove, in order to stay, that they have the same types of fears that a refugee has. And the 5 fears, we talked about them earlier: race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or a member of a social group. So for example, let's say you are, perfect example, let's say you are from China, okay? And you're an Uyghur, one of the groups of people that are currently being persecuted and having acts of genocide committed against them in Western China. Mm-hmm. And
for those who are interested, you can go watch there's 2 episodes on global issues where we talk about this.
Absolutely. It was episode 14 and 14 and a half.
Yeah. 12 and a half.
12 and 12 and a half. 12
yeah.
and 12 and 5. That's right. Yes. I apologize. Yes. And again, when I went to Wake Forest, there were a whole lot of Chinese students there. Mm-hmm. Let's say you come into the country on a student visa. Then you realize, whoa, I'm a member of this group. I'm not from Beijing or Shanghai or Kunming or Chengdu or Shenzhen, China, or Guangzhou, China. I'm a member of one of these people who are being persecuted. I have family and friends that I went to school with that are now being tortured and having acts of genocide committed against them because they're Muslim.
Yeah.
Wait a minute, I belong to this group. If I go back there, I'm going to die. I have to stay here. At that point, the proverbial Chinese student will go ahead and apply for asylum and say, hey, look, here's why I can't go back to China. Because if I go back to China, I'm a member of this group that's being persecuted. And if I go there, I will die. So I have to stay. And that's that sort of situation where asylum seekers find themselves. Mm-hmm. Now, you have other types of people. We're seeing this in some countries. We're seeing this, quite honestly, in certain parts of Colombia. and in Venezuela, where you have internally displaced people,
Mm-hmm.
people who are forced to leave their home, but they don't leave the borders of their country. You
And in
typically,
Yemen too. That's a
and then
big
I was
one.
just going to say, in Yemen also,
Yeah,
you typically see internally displaced people where there's not an opportunity to travel, or travel is inhospitable or unrealistic, or there's a climate situation which prevents them from being able to go from one place to another to find some sort of refuge, which is the root word of refugee. Now, you can have what's called a stateless person, where you don't have any citizenship. You're just like, look, you don't belong to anybody. And the situation in Myanmar with the Rohingya is, and there's an entire history about this. There's loads of videos you can watch on YouTube about this, but it talks about the statelessness of the Rohingya people and how many of them had tried to go to Bangladesh, but Bangladesh was like, yo, where are your papers? And they're like, we don't have any papers because the Burmese government didn't give us any. Well, you can't get any help from us because we don't know what country you're from. See you later. Go back. And that's happening with the Rohingya people in Rakhine State. So stateless people, and being stateless goes against the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, because the Universal Declaration of Human Rights says that everyone has a right to a country. You gotta belong somewhere. Some people might belong to more than one country, and that might be through citizenship, birth, the descent rule, which is through passports and stuff. And I'm actually working on that, but that's a whole other conversation. But yeah, it's difficult to try to get a grasp on trying to track all of these people, because in many instances we don't know. Sure, you can track migration, but you don't know necessarily where people are coming from primarily, or where they're going to, or where they would like to resettle potentially.
Yeah, it's tough, especially because many instances you don't have papers, and you lose your papers or passport or whatever you have in transit, especially in the case of both Syrian refugees and many refugees from Africa going to Europe, because often they're going by boat and are paying exorbitant amounts of money to travel across the sea in a dinghy. And as we saw with the Syrian refugee, I don't know if you remember that image that came out in 2015 that was of a child who had passed on the beach. And that was like sort of the really most telling and widely used image of the crisis. And it's dangerous. It's really dangerous. And people are leaving their countries to do that very, very dangerous thing and paying lots and lots of money to do it because they're being persecuted. So so this topic is not one that can just be stats, I don't think.
No.
Because I just want people to remember the humanity behind this. These are not people that are just trying to get into your country because of whatever political view you have that may or may not be helpful.
Right.
These people are being persecuted, fleeing things that are threatening their life and the life of their families. So so the conservative policies that both the US and Canada have implemented and reinforced the last several years are just awful and tragic. And they are.
And I vividly remember an Ethiopian refugee who I'd worked with, who told me a story of when he was on one of those boats. He was on one of those boats, and the boat ended up on the shores of Italy. And thankfully he knew Italian, because I know he spent some time in Eritrea also, because Eritrea at one point was a part of Ethiopia, but then Eritrea broke off and became its own country. I want to say in the early 90s, if I'm not mistaken. You might want to fact check me on that. But Yeah, he knew fluent Italian, and he spoke fluent Tigrinya, he spoke fluent Amharic, and his English was actually quite good. And I remember him telling me stories about when he was on one of those boats. And I that was one of those nights where I didn't go to bed right away. It was difficult. And I know when we talked about refugees, the United Nations has a major role with what happens with refugees. And there, in 1951, there was a Refugee Convention, which basically gives you the definition of what a refugee actually is, and there's an actual full official definition, but I basically summarized it because I didn't feel like reading off a computer screen. But the Refugee Convention also tells you defines what a refugee is, or who a refugee is, and what kind of benefits they get. It also tells you who does not qualify to be a refugee. So for example, if you're a war criminal, no, you don't get to be a refugee. If you commit crimes against peace or crimes against humanity, you don't get to be a refugee. If you commit a serious non-political crime, you don't get to be a refugee. The other type of person that does not get to be a refugee, or really doesn't get to be an asylum seeker, or what's called an asylee, is a current soldier. So if you're a soldier in the throes of military conflict, you don't get to say, yo, I want to be a refugee. No, because you're committing crimes, war that goes against the whole definition of being a refugee in the first place. Now, in the United States, there are various populations of people who get what's called reception and placement benefits through the Office of Refugee Resettlement, which is under the jurisdiction of the Department of Health and Human Services. Now, these types of people, and earlier on when I said, oh, there's 18,000 refugees, this list of people also counts towards that 18,000, right? Mm-hmm. So it's not just 18,000 refugees and then however many other amounts of these other people I'm going to talk about. Mm-hmm. It's 18,000, it's an aggregate of refugees, asylum seekers, participants in what's called the Cuban and Haitian Entrant Program, otherwise called CHEP, and they get a specific type of resettlement, which is called parole. That's a whole other conversation. You have special immigration visa holders. Typically, these are Iraqis and Pakistanis. You might get an Afghani in there. And they've done some work for the United States military at some point, either in some sort of military capacity, combat-wise, or they're more often than not interpreters or translators. I've worked with some special immigration visa holders who one of them was actually a college professor with a doctorate in linguistics, and he was an interpreter and a translator. And he worked and he was doing military translation for the United States government. And yikes, that's not good if you're living in the country and you're helping the U.S. in some sort of military intervention. You have victims of human trafficking. I actually worked with a couple of people who were victims of human trafficking, torture survivors, unaccompanied minors, and the last group, which you don't see a whole lot of, are what's called Amerasians. And Amerasians are children that were born out of Southeastern Asian conflict. And you have to be born within a specific time frame. It's usually around the time of the Vietnam War to when the Vietnam War ended. And you have to prove that you have one Asian parent and one American parent. And you have to prove that you're being persecuted because of your biracial status, because you're part Southeastern Asian and part American. So those are the groups of people that are part of that 18,000 person allotment. It's not just 18,000 refugees, or in years past, it wasn't 85,000 refugees. It was all of these together that make up that sort of quote unquote refugee allotment. So
yeah, it's similar in Canada where, their program pays refugees or any of those types of folks for 1 year, and they give them $25,000, which is not enough to live in Canada in most places, but and it's just 1 year. So it does count for that sort of fiscal year, whether those people are coming in like as refugees in that year or not. It's whoever gets the funds.
Right, right. In the United States, it works a bit differently. There's obviously health screenings that take place there's a phenomenon that's in the United States that I actually read a paper about this. It's called the refugee lottery, where based upon which state you live in, or I'm sorry, not which state you live in, but which state you get repatriated to if you're coming into the United States, the benefits that you get could be dramatically better in some states than in others. There are some states that have what's called a match grant program. There are some states that have what's called a PPP program, which is public-private partnership program. There are some states that have what's called the Wilson Fish program, and I'm not too familiar with Wilson Fish because the places where I've worked, they've all been either match grant or PPP states. But based upon what state you get resettled into, and obviously with each state, you have tax implications that come through with this. And if we go back to, I think it was episode number 5 of the Joe and Kat Chat series, we talked about healthcare in the United States. And we talked about the Medicaid expansion and how some states accepted the Medicaid expansion and some didn't. That also plays a role into health benefits and health care for these refugees, because some states said, yeah, we'll give you extra money. And other states were like, no, we're not accepting that block grant of money. Sorry. So that all plays a role into that. It also plays a role into the jobs that you see many of these refugees take on. It also plays a role into language learning, literacy. There are some who don't know how to read. There are some who have some level of reading. There are some who have college degrees. There's one refugee who I will never forget as long as I live, when I volunteered at World Relief, and it was me and him every day for the better part of 5 months. And he had a law degree. He had a PhD in Arabic studies. He had written 9 books. He had written 4 movie screenplays.
Cool.
Yeah, I'll leave his name out of it because, privacy. But yeah, he was also tortured by the Iraqi government. His wife and son were killed by the Iraqi government. He ended up moving to Turkey. The Iraqi government found him in Turkey. He eventually ended up in the United States. And then he and I ended up working together. And I lost contact with him. We would, even every once in a while, for about a year after I'd left World Relief, he and I would talk on Facebook, and I would have to use a translator because he would type in Arabic, and I'm like, I can't read that. So he and I would talk. And he would post stuff on his Facebook page. And he didn't have one of these fan pages. He just had a normal Facebook page. And he would post something, and he would get 35,000 likes, 895 comments. And I'm like, and I knew this guy was sort of important because he would travel to Washington, D.C. by himself and just talk to people in various departments. And again, he knew a little bit of English, but not much. But he would just talk to people, and people would kind of communicate with him. You'd see him in pictures and selfies, and he'd show pictures of himself with politicians in Washington, D.C. on the phone. And I'm like, how do you do this? He said, you just say something in Arabic, and I would nod like, okay, yeah, sure. All right, let's go grocery shopping. Let's go. And yeah, man, he was a real special dude, man. And I hope everything's okay with him. I haven't talked to him in a while, but it's these kind of stories where these types of stories where you hear about people being persecuted. And there's another concept that I want to make sure that I bring up to the discussion. It's a concept called refoulement. It's spelled refoulement, but it's a French word, refoulement, where it's basically, if a third-party country accepts you, that third-party country cannot send you back to the country where you came from, because that puts you in harm's way. So, and a perfect example of a refoulement is what's happening in Israel right now, where Israel has said, hey, you know what? Yeah, we have Ethiopians who are Jewish, and by birthright, they have a right to resettle in Ethiopia because they're Jewish. They're no less
Israel.
Jewish.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry, they're settling in Israel.
In Israel, right. Ethiopians that are resettling in Israel. They're no less Jewish than German Jews or Ashkenazi Jews in Russia. They're Jewish. But Benjamin Netanyahu was like, oh, you're from Ethiopia? No, we don't want you here. You're black. You got to get out. And we're going to pay you 2,000 euros to get out.
Because he's a giant racist. Just to be clear.
Exactly. So that is an example of refoulement, because it's like, well, wait a minute. You can't send me back to Ethiopia, because if I go back to Ethiopia, I might die. I might get killed. Can't do that. But that is happening right now. And more, in addition to what's happening in Palestine, that's also a humanitarian situation that not only needs attention, but needs addressing immediately. Yeah. Because again, that is a crime against humanity.
Absolutely.
Sending a refugee who is coming to to a country, not only to get away from persecution, but going to a country where, based upon religion, they have a right to be there. And you're telling them, nah, because you got darker skin than me, nah, you can't be here. It's happening.
Yeah, I mean, that's such a good example. I'm glad you brought that up, because it really demonstrates sort of the different facets of persecution that makes someone a refugee. Like, you're being persecuted in Ethiopia for religious affiliation because you're a Jew, or you're practicing Jewish religion, and then you're arriving. Yes, thank you. Sorry. Okay. And then you're arriving somewhere and then being persecuted for your race, even though you're in a place that is supposed to be,
accepting of your religion.
Exactly. Yes. Oh my gosh, my words are not working today.
It's okay. It's okay. It's one of those days. I got it. So it's a shame that these sorts of situations are happening. And speaking of religion, and I've noticed this because in the United States, you have 9 agencies that provide what's called reception and placement benefits. And these 9 agencies are called VoLags. They're what's voluntary agencies. And these 9 agencies are Church World Service, the Episcopalian Migration Ministries, you have the Ethiopian Community Development Council, the Hebrew Immigration Aid Service, let me think, the International Rescue Committee, World Relief, Lutheran Immigration and Relief Services. You have the United States Committee for Refugees and Immigrants, and the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops. Now, if you've noticed what I've said in all of those, what did you notice a strong theme amongst all of those?
I mean, they're all just like different sects of certain religions.
Very good. Exactly.
Yeah. Exactly.
The only one of these 9 VoLags that is non-secular is the International Rescue Committee.
Okay, yeah. That is secular, you mean, like not religiously affiliated?
Not religiously affiliated, correct.
Yeah, okay.
Not religiously affiliated. All of the other ones have some type of religious affiliation with and or to them. Of those 9 VoLags, the international 8 of them are headquartered either in Baltimore, Washington, D.C., or in the Northern Virginia suburb. The one that is not headquartered globally in one of those areas is the International Rescue Committee, and they're headquartered in London, England.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah.
In fact, World Relief and Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Service, they're both headquartered in Baltimore.
Huh.
They're both
Do you know why that is?
Yes, absolutely. The major reason why that is, and I'm surprised, and there's a lot of large humanitarian organizations, in fact, secular organizations, that are actually headquartered in Baltimore. For example, Catholic Relief Services, world headquarters is in downtown Baltimore. There's another large religious organization that's in Lutherville, Maryland. Their world headquarters is out there. But quite honestly, many of them used to be in New York City, but cost of living and cost of renting a place and space to actually do your work got too expensive. And being in Baltimore, the cost of living was less expensive. You could pay your employees a requisite salary that reflects the cost of living. And you can get to Washington, D.C. from Baltimore or from Arlington, Virginia, or Fairfax in about 45 minutes to an hour, depending on traffic. And if you're on a train from Baltimore, it's 45 minutes, MARC train, Penn Station, the Union Station in DC, get on the DC Metro, you get where you have to go. It's easy. So that's usually the reason why a lot of these VoLags ended up in Baltimore or not in New York or not in Los Angeles. The other reason why they're East Coast centric, specifically this area, well, I shouldn't say this area because I'm not in that area anymore, but specifically in the Mid-Atlantic, is because of access to airports and access to other states in terms of airplane and airport hubs to other major cities and states around the United States.
Yeah.
The other part of it is it's a lot less expensive to fly from a particular place in Europe when you're coming from, let's say, Africa. Rarely will you get a refugee coming from Africa that's going to fly directly to the United States. That normally doesn't happen. Normally, these are normally 3 or 4 flight journeys where you're saying, okay, I'm coming from Yaoundé, Cameroon. I'm going from there to Cairo, Egypt to Charles de Gaulle Airport in Paris, Paris nonstop to Dulles Airport in Washington, D.C. Something along those lines.
Yeah.
You're flying all over the place because these flights are not cheap. And if you get these multi-segment flights, they tend to be a little less expensive than a nonstop flight on Ethiopia Airways or South African Airways or whatever airline will go nonstop across the Atlantic Ocean from Africa. So you see that happen quite a bit where you end up in the East Coast, and these organizations have a tendency to be headquartered in the East Coast.
That's so interesting. Yeah, thanks for answering that. Yeah, I think we're at about the 10-minute mark for how much time we have left, but I think that something I just wanted to sort of ask you about is the resettlement process. We've touched on that a bit for the USA. Yep. And in Canada, I mean, I mentioned that often the government-sponsored refugees get $25,000 through the Resettlement Assistance Program. They can get temporary housing for up to a year, right. Access to social programs, but I would say most of those folks don't understand how to navigate the complex system, which you also, you were a worker for that system. Right. And so I just wanted to kind of say, and also in Canada, there is a privately sponsored refugee program where usually it's like a group that sponsors a family for a year. But
typically in the United States, that situation when you have a family that sponsors a refugee, it's when you get the refugee file, the caseworker will look and say, oh, well, do you have any relatives? So they'll say yes. That relative to that particular refugee or person receiving humanitarian assistance, it's what's called a tie, T-I-E, okay? And then that tie would stay with that member of that family member, or what's called an anchor family. Just want to make sure I add that to the conversation also.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, it's the same in Canada. There's that aspect, and there's also just like people, like groups of families or communities or church groups or whatever that just like pool their money together and sponsor. Especially, it happened a lot when the Syrian refugees started coming in 2015.
Yes.
Or it was around 2015 when it was the worst, I should say. But something I just wanted to mention is yes, many of these refugees are assigned to, people to help them navigate these complex systems. But one thing is just that I just want people to know how isolating and difficult it is to just be a refugee in a new place, over and above the persecution and violence that you're escaping. Like then you're landing in a place and don't necessarily know the language. It's really isolating. You don't know anyone. You may or may not be with your family. And then you're assigned these usually like social workers or some sort of assistance program worker to help you navigate this system. You may not understand them. And it is really difficult. And so I just wanted to point out that the Canadian government has a beautiful webpage that it just says, oh, we take care of our refugees so well. But really, in reality, it's just not that. It's a complex system that is super difficult to navigate. And $25,000 means you're still in like very impoverished. So if you have no way to get a job right away, or don't know how to get a job, especially if there's a language barrier, it's just it's over and above the persecution you've already faced. It's really difficult. And so I just want people to understand that aspect of this conversation.
Yeah, and thanks for bringing that up, because a lot of times in many of the places where I've helped refugees get resettled, in the 3 organizations that I've been privileged enough to work at and for, in many instances, what you'll see happening is resettlement in particular neighborhoods where there's already groups of that particular groups of those particular people that have already been resettled there. So when I was interning at the International Rescue Committee, there would primarily be 2 areas where you would have groups of refugees. You would have most of your Southeastern Asian refugees on the west side of Baltimore, just off of Frederick Road in that one apartment complex. And then you would have most of your African refugees and your Syrian refugees off of Moravia Road on the east side of Baltimore. Mm-hmm. And even within that, the Ethiopians would kind of be in around a couple of different apartment buildings. The Eritreans will be in another group. You'd have your Syrians kind of a little bit further away, but you knew where they were. You had your Sudanese and your Rwandan refugees and your Cameroonians and your Democratic or Congo refugees kind of grouped in one area. So they tried to make the resettlement a bit easier based upon nationality, because it's easier to, I guess, pool your resources if you already have a group of, let's say, Ethiopian refugees already there, and you had somebody that can speak the language. You had somebody that understands what's going on culturally. You had somebody there that in case you can't get a hold of your caseworker, you can knock on the person's door 2 apartment buildings away, and they can help you get on the bus and go from one place to another. It's that sort of community-minded aspect that you might tend to have in some places that you may not necessarily have in Canada, because Canada is so spread out. It's already super multicultural, and just because it's multicultural doesn't necessarily mean that it's culturally competent for that particular refugee's resettlement success.
Yeah, no, I think in the big cities, and actually in smaller towns and cities as well, it's a similar thing. I think the government and the organizations do try to settle people in similar areas because of those things. But on the other hand, is once you're here and there's sort of this area or neighborhood or whatever where lots of refugees are settled, then we can start talking about sort of the implications of how that is perceived by the receiving country. And because we talk about race and racism and systemic oppression a lot on these chats,
of course we do.
You can kind of see how that might then contribute. Like I'm glad that happens, because it would contribute to lessening the isolation, because if you're around people that speak the same language or whatever, that's great. But then the other side of that is like the folks in the receiving country and those communities might start to develop racist views and start to impose this upon the refugees. So I just want to also mention that. We don't have time to get into it, but it's something that we need to be thinking about when we're implementing these policies, and well-intentioned things like that can have unintended consequences.
Absolutely. And the other aspect to all of this, and I remember this on several occasions, is when a refugee resettles into the country, food. And we talked about food insecurity in a previous episode of the Joe and Cat Chat series. And in many instances, these refugees usually end up with limited food options. And if you're Muslim, you have a strict cultural diet that you adhere to based upon your religion. And it's difficult in some places if you don't live near a center that is multicultural to find halal meat. It's difficult to do that. I vividly remember working with one of the Afghani refugees who came in on a special immigration visa, and he said, and he had a whole bunch of vegetables, but he ate meat. And he was like, look, do you know where there is a place where I can find halal meat? And I was like, I've been vegan for 11 years. What do I know about halal meat? But I ended up having to find a place for him, and we ended up driving about 30 minutes away from where he lived to stock up on halal meat. Halal is an Arabic word meaning permitted or allowed. The opposite word of halal is a word called haram. As in Boko Haram, the terrorist organization that you see in haram, means forbidden. Halal, approved. Haram, forbidden.
That's so interesting.
Food is a big, big deal. Dietary restrictions are a big deal. I remember working with the Burmese group, and yeah, that's a whole other conversation. We could spend an hour talking about the thesis and the project that I did with them, but I know we're running short on time. But food is a big issue, and making sure that you have dietary competent and dietarily related food types for the people that you're trying to help and serve is absolutely important. And it's more than just, okay, hey, yeah, they're being somewhat stereotypical and saying, oh, well, they're Asian, they must eat primarily rice. Well, yeah, sure, but there's more than just rice, or there's more than just meat, or there's more than just certain types of fruit and grow in particular areas. There are dietary and cultural aspects to the food that people eat. No different than you and me.
Exactly. Yeah. And something we also didn't get to is that's super relevant in the refugee camps too, where people go and seek asylum or seek refugee status and are just sort of in limbo, like you mentioned at the start of the episode.
Yes.
They have an application and now they're just in a refugee camp for potentially years, often several months. And yeah, the food issue in those places is a very big problem because a lot of times it's just grains from America or from Africa or wherever they get it from. Usually it's sponsored by an organization or whatever. But yeah, something else to keep in mind.
Absolutely.
So Joe, we're out of time.
We are out of time. And as usual, there's a pile of stuff we didn't get to. We didn't talk about the Human Rights Declaration on ending slavery. We didn't talk about the Dublin Regulation. We didn't get to talk about the situation in in Greece and in Italy and in Malta that's taking place right now. We didn't get to talk about how Germany accepted over 1 million refugees over about an 18-month time frame. There's a lot to talk about. This might even be a part 2. Yeah. Maybe we'll explore that a little bit later down the line. But Ms. Wells, as always, thank you for the conversation and your insight and your intellect with regards to all of this, because again, this is important stuff that we want to make sure that we continue to highlight and illuminate with the rest of the world.
Yeah, and right back at you. Thank you for the insights and the stories, and it's beautiful. And I encourage everyone to look up those few things that we missed. Also, there's some news with the EU changing their rules around refugee status. But we have to go. So thank you so much.
You're welcome.
And as always, tune in every Tuesday.
Right. Tune in every Tuesday. We got you.
Yes. Take care.
Right. Peace.